Good evening. It's such a joy to be with you, and it's my first visit to Villanova ever. And as I was coming here, I said, this isn't in Philadelphia. I mean, where are we going? But it's really a beautiful time to be here, and I'm so thrilled to be here on the occasion of the unveiling of such a stunning portrait. I have to say, I've never been a huge fan of St. Augustine. I know you're not supposed to say that at an Augustinian institution, but this portrait now is making me a believer. Because now I can see myself in him and see him as he was. It's a joy to be with you. Lamentation, a theoethical reflection on the Black Exodus. I want to thank Dr. Pratt for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Father Peter, for the invitation to be here. As we break open this very important topic that doesn't get a whole lot of attention that it deserves. Tonight we're gathered during the Mother Mary Lange series to talk about the Black Catholic Church. It's a celebration of the contributions and the existence of Black Catholics, a group that is often overlooked by both Black Protestants and by white Catholics. And so we've had a number of contributions throughout our history. I want to lift up some of them tonight. But I want to stress tonight that I don't want to simply celebrate the existence of Black Catholics. I want to engage in an honest adult conversation about our church and the systemic obstacles that Black Catholics face in the Catholic Church. Now, notice I said an honest adult conversation. That means that we're going to have to talk about some very difficult truths. Mother Mary Lange herself, in one of her letters, wrote, "We do not conceal the difficulty of our situation as persons of color and religious at the same time." We do not conceal the difficulty of our situation. In other words, the Oblate Sisters of Providence were founded because of a systemic difficulty in the Catholic Church. That many, almost most members of religious communities would not accept women of African descent as members or honor their vocation as religious women. Black Catholic witness means that we've had to struggle for our faith. But this struggle, as historians such as Father Cyprian Davis and Dr. Shannon D. Williams have reminded us, has often been with members of our own faith household. It's a faith that we've clung to despite the sad counter-witness of our own fellow Catholics. This means we need to have an adult conversation. And so what I wanted to do tonight is to lay out for you the impact, or one of the impacts, or one of the effects of this terrible, tenacious witness that we've had as Black Catholics and the difficulties we've encountered within our own church. I want to talk about the tenacity of our faith, but also talk about the reasons why that tenacity is necessary. And so I notice that there are a number of students that are here, and your professors gave you papers you have to fill out. In other words, you're bribed to be here because you're going to get extra credit by writing something. So if you're here for that purpose, I'm going to talk about 3 questions. I'm writing your paper for you now, so listen up. I'm going to talk about 3 questions. I want to talk about this Black Catholic exodus out of the church, and those 3 questions are, why is this happening? What does this exodus have to say about the Catholic Church? And then thirdly, what can we do about it? Have you written that down yet? Why is this happening? What does this say about the Catholic Church? And what can or should we do about it? Now, you know the beginning, the middle, and the end. So now if you tune out, that's your own fault, but at least you have the outline for your paper. In February of 2021, the Pew Research Center published the most comprehensive survey to date of Black faith in America. This report, called Faith Among Black Americans, gives us a major resource for understanding U.S. Black religious life and all of its manifestations, including those who identify as Catholic, Protestant, non-Christian, and unaffiliated. Your own Dr. Pratt was a major resource for this Pew study. Thank you for making sure that Black Catholics were really represented in this study. What's especially noteworthy is that this is the first national study of Black faith in America to include a sampling of Black Catholics sufficient to yield reliable data about this faith community. Unlike other studies of the Black church, such as the PBS documentary given by Henry Louis Gates, these documentaries ignore or overlook the existence of Black Catholics. This investigation treats Black Catholics as an integral part of the religious expression of persons of African descent in the United States. Thus, for the first time in over 50 years, and certainly for the first time in my almost 40 years of priesthood, we have reliable data about the beliefs and practices of Black Catholics. And yet this report has not received in-depth attention or analysis from the Catholic faith community. For example, we now know how many Black Catholics there are. Black Catholics comprise 4% of the U.S. Catholic population. That's substantially less than the Black presence in the nation's population. We're about 13% of the U.S. population. Black Catholics also number only 6% of the nation's Black religious believers, compared to 66% who are Protestants. Yet it's important to note that these small percentages still number in the millions. The nation's 3 million Black Catholics are more numerous than both Black Episcopalians, who number about 80,000, and members of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the nation's oldest historically Black denomination, which has about 2.5 million members globally. One would hope then that the concerns and the needs of millions of the Catholic faithful would be of interest to the wider church and its leaders. We also know the composition of this population relative to those who are native African Americans and those who are Black Catholic immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa and from the Caribbean. We get a picture of the complexity and the diversity of Black Catholic life in the United States. We also know, for example, that Black Catholics are more liberal on sexual and gender issues than Black Catholics. For example, Black Catholics, by a margin of 78%, are more accepting of homosexuality than even Black unaffiliated persons, about 75%, and far more accepting than Black Protestants, 57%. Indeed, Black Catholics as a whole are more accepting of same-sex relationships than the U.S. adult population as a whole. Also, only 16% of Black Catholics see opposition to premarital sex as being essential or important for their faith, as opposed to 30% of Black Protestants. Perhaps surprisingly, 71% of Black Catholics believe that abortion should be legal in all or most cases, as opposed to about 68% of Black Catholics versus 59% of most U.S. adults. Only 22% of Black Catholics see opposing abortion as essential to understanding their faith. Opposition to abortion is not a major badge of Black religious identity, Catholic or Protestant. However, I want to highlight one particular finding from this study, namely the massive defection of Black Catholics from the Catholic Church. One of this research's most distressing revelations concerns the number of African Americans who are former members of the church. Only 54% of Black adults who were raised Catholic continue to identify as Catholic. This compares to 81% of Black adults who were raised as Protestant and who are currently Protestant, and 61% of white Americans who remain Catholic into adulthood. Moreover, African Americans who leave the Catholic Church are about equally likely to become either Protestant or unaffiliated with any organized religion. But African Americans who leave Protestant denominations, whether historically Black or white, are highly unlikely to become Catholic. Thus, Black Catholics who were raised in the faith are less likely to remain Catholic than Catholic Americans overall. We are witnessing an exodus of African Americans from the Catholic Church. What makes this especially significant is that the percentage of religiously unaffiliated Black adults increases as the generational cohorts grow younger. While 21% of Black Americans overall are unaffiliated with any organized religion, among millennials and Generation Z, the percentages grow to 33% and 28% respectively. Thus, the Black Catholic population is both decreasing and aging. Now, just so we can spread the misery around a little bit, white Catholics are also leaving the Catholic Church. Yeah, the amen corner of the white Catholics up here smiling at me now. Yeah, you're saying, okay, you don't have to route yourself, okay? That's all right. But they're not leaving at the same rate, nor necessarily for the same reasons. And this brings me to my questions. Why is this exodus happening? What does this exodus have to say about U.S. Catholicism? And finally, what kind of theological and pastoral responses are we to give to this exodus? So, to the first question, why are we leaving? This massive rate of Black defection raises the uncomfortable question, why? Let's note what the Pew Research says are not the issues or factors. The report indicates that this is not because Black people are less religious than other racial or ethnic groups. In fact, the opposite is true. African Americans are far more religious in terms of believing in God, engaging in regular prayer, reading the Bible, and engaging in faith-based social activism than white Americans. On every measure of religiosity, African Americans are among the most religiously observant in the nation. Nor is the exodus because of the racial composition of Catholic parishes. You might say, well, they don't want to join white communities. Well, that's not what the research says. The research shows that Black Catholics live our faith in multiracial settings. The great majority of Black Catholics, 82%, worship in multiracial parish settings, where the parish either has no racial majority group or the majority of the parish is black, but the congregational leader is not, or the priest is black but ministers to a largely white parish. Only 17% of black Catholics worship in a predominantly black parish that's led by black clergy. That's very different from the Protestant experience, where the vast majority worship in black settings led by black ministers. Moreover, the research shows that black Catholics, like other Americans, black Americans, have a strong preference for racially mixed parishes. The racial demography or membership of the Catholic parish is not in itself a significant factor in the exodus out of the church. The factors contributing to the exodus lie in a different direction. More than 3/4 of black Catholics say that opposing racism is an essential or important part of their faith. But research shows that only 13% of white Catholics say that opposing racism is essential or important to their faith. 3/4 of black Catholics want and expect to hear sermons that are relevant to the distinctive struggles of black people in America. Yet less than a third of those who worship in predominantly white parishes heard sermons during the summer of 2020 that addressed the massive protests that arose over the nation's callous indifference to black lives. Black Catholics were more likely to hear sermons opposing abortion, which is far less significant for black religious identity, than any related to racial justice. Moreover, among white Americans, regular church attendance is highly correlated with membership in the Republican Party. The more religious white people are, the more likely they are Republican. And the 2020 presidential standard bearer made explicit appeals based on right racial grievance and fear. Among black Americans, regular church attendance is highly correlated with Democratic Party membership. This is not surprising, therefore, that there were highly publicized incidents of white Catholic priests taking strongly negative and pejorative stances toward the Black Lives Matter movement, declaring this movement as one that Catholics could not and should not endorse, and denouncing Black Lives Matter protesters of the summer of 2020 as maggots and parasites and thugs. Nor is it surprising that 57% of white Catholics voted for the former president's reelection, a greater percentage than voted for him in 2016, despite, or the research suggests, because of his advocacy of white racial grievance. This is important. Oftentimes we hear that Catholics voted the way they did, white Catholics voted the way they did, because they're concerned for pro-life. The research does not bear that out. It was because of his appeal to racial grievance and fear. This is a man who called himself a nationalist. And let's understand what we mean by white nationalism. White nationalism is the non-rational, instinctual, visceral conviction that this country's institutions, its public spaces, its political institutions, its cultural heritage, that these belong or should belong to white people in a way that they do not and should not belong to others. Nationalism is not about hate. It's about who belongs, who counts, who matters, whose church is this, whose country is this. It's a longing for a white utopia, for a place of unquestioned white privilege. And that, sadly, is what Black Catholics have to contend with all too often in our church, as we're told in ways both subtle and blatant that we don't belong here, or we belong by exception, by toleration, but not by right. As I said, we need to have an honest adult conversation. The Black exodus from the Catholic Church is due to a fundamental disconnect between what the vast majority of Black Catholics and other Black Americans see as essential to their religious faith and the concerns being addressed in most white congregations and white Catholic leaders. It's not the white complexion of the Catholic Church's members that is an issue. The defection of almost half of Black Catholic adults is due to the unwillingness of the white Catholic community to engage realities that are existentially important for African American believers and Black Catholics. In fact, all too often, the explicit message given by many leading Catholic figures is that concerns that are central to Black religious faith are irrelevant, even incompatible with the Catholic faith. This is the major reason, according to the best data that we have, for why many Black Catholics leave the church and most other Black Americans do not join. Let me pause here and just speak very personally for just a moment. It gives me no joy to be talking this way. I'm wearing a collar. Next year, I'm celebrating 40 years of ordination. I've given my life to this church. I love this church. The sisters who are here, the oblates, love this church. But we must speak frankly about the difficulty of our situation. And we must ask the questions, what is happening in our church that leads to this kind of situation? Because, frankly, we have not gotten here overnight. This has been a long time coming. Recall that back in 2008, we were being told that if we voted for the first African American president, that we were committing a mortal sin, and we needed to go to confession before we could receive communion. That while the rest of the world, even the Vatican, was rejoicing over what they saw as this major breakthrough in American race relations, leaders in our church here in this country were saying that this was not something to be rejoiced over. Rather, one leading bishop said, this is our Calvary, our Golgotha, our cross. This is the fundamental disconnect which we must raise and be honest about if we're to move forward and heal and become what I believe Jesus Christ would want of his church. So what does this exodus say about U.S. Catholicism? This massive exodus from the church raises disturbing questions. What kind of church are we if racial justice, practically speaking, is considered irrelevant or at best non-essential to being a disciple of Jesus? And moreover, how can the Catholic Church be what it says it is? Catholic, universal. How many of you learned that back in the day? That what does Catholic mean? Universal, right? If you heard that, just raise your hand. Okay, good. All right. Oh, wow. Even the kids up here, I love you guys, okay? You guys can't see it, but they have been glued to this. I wish I could take you back to Fordham, okay? Because my students don't listen to me like that. They say, oh, we just hear you all the time, okay? But you guys are great, okay? Father Peter, you got a good thing going here, but do not show this tape at Fordham, okay? Otherwise I'll lose my job. They'll probably want me to come here and teach at Villanova. Who knows? No, oh, no. That's how rumors get started. We don't want that. Well, we'll see, because we're just getting started with this. The Pew Research report provides empirical evidence for what I, in my work, have called the normative whiteness of the Catholic Church. As I concluded in my monograph, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, the sentence that gets quoted the most is this: what makes the U.S. Catholic Church a white racist institution is not the fact that the majority of its members are of European descent. What makes it white and racist is the pervasive belief that European aesthetics, music, theology, and persons, and only these, are standard, normative, universal, and truly Catholic. All others are Catholic by toleration or exception. I am sure that there will be people on Twitter and Facebook wondering why Villanova has a black St. Augustine. That opposition is what I mean by the normative whiteness of the church. Or people who will look at black sisters and black clergy and wonder, well, are you really a sister? Are you really a priest? That's what I mean by the normative whiteness of the church. Or wondering if there's a gospel choir that sings. Is that really Catholic music? Oh no, this is true. This is what we mean by the normative whiteness of the church. Because of this basic orientation to whiteness as a measure of reality, the religious strivings and spiritual strivings of black people cannot be taken seriously. These quests must be ignored and disregarded, omitted, or vilified, because taking them seriously challenges the fundamental structure of white Christian belief and identity in the United States. To put this more bluntly, the Catholic Church in the United States has sadly made a commitment to white supremacy as a religious worldview, where whiteness is more normative and critical for church membership and for policy making than the cross and resurrection of Jesus. White supremacy is the real religion, the popular religion, the folk religion of the United States, and, sadly, of a majority of white American Christians. This is a conviction that I first expressed in my book on racial justice, when I described racism as a folk religion and as being a substitute religious worldview, but received little attention or notice. But I think we need to go back and look at that in view of the exodus taking place. There, I examined a perspective that was developed first by a theologian named Gary Chamberlain. You're not supposed to put a whole lot of words on a PowerPoint, but this is an important quotation, so let's look at it. In order to understand the depth of racism in American society, and among practicing Christians, to grasp its persistence despite all rational arguments against it, racism is viewed as a substitute religion. Racism is a symbol system which functions as an unconscious, unreflective meaning system, resting upon symbols of color and sex, which are deeply embedded in the fears and anxieties of white Americans. The terms white, black, mingling, mixing, blood take on meanings and identity functions which reflect a worldview as strong or stronger than the Christian symbols of cross, bread, wine, resurrection, brotherhood, and family of man. White supremacist religion expresses a worldview where blood and color and sexuality are more foundational for white identity and meaning than bread and wine and water and the cross. The sociologist of religion, Robert Jones, describes the power and prevalence of this when he writes that as a result of this practical commitment, white supremacist groups would have more success recruiting for new members in the parking lots of white Christian churches after Sunday services than approaching whites who are at coffee shops on Sunday morning and who skipped church. We don't like to think about this. But now we need to call this by its proper name. Making whiteness the normative measure of Christian belief and commitment is nothing other than idolatry. Idolatry, for the benefit of my young students here, doesn't just refer to Moses coming down in the movie of Ten Commandments and taking those big stones and throwing them at this golden calf and it blowing up in a glorious technicolor. You're laughing, but most adults think the same thing. We don't think that idolatry has anything to do with contemporary life. But many theologians, myself, Professor Sean Copeland, formerly at Boston College, and others, are saying that we cannot understand the crisis that faces us unless we call it by what it is. But rather than quoting myself or Sean Copeland, let's look at what a white Catholic theologian has to say. Because after all, if a white person says it, it must have some greater truth value. So let's see what's going on here. John Nielsen of Loyola University of Chicago writes, "What does it mean if we find ourselves praying to a God who does not trouble us about these injustices? What kind of God leaves Christians ignorant or complacent in the face of such evils? Whoever that God might be, it is not the God of Jeremiah, Micah, and Jesus. Thus, racism is not only sinful and heretical in its denial of the equal dignity of all God's children, racism is idolatry. In the place of the God whom Jesus proclaims and makes present, white supremacy substitutes an idol that leaves its devotees untroubled by massive injustice and unaware that they're not worshiping the true and living God of love and justice." Let me break this down. When I ask my students at Fordham how many of them have heard a homily in the last 3 years that deals about the reality of racism, scarcely any raise their hands. What does it say that we can attend church and not hear this raised as an issue? What God do we really believe in? What kind of God would leave us untroubled? What does it mean then? Right now, there's a major debate in our country over whether Catholics believe in the Eucharist. We're having a big Eucharistic revival in the next 3 years. They try to convince Catholics to believe in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. But I want to say that in light of in light of this research, that the major challenge facing American Catholic believers is not a lack of belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. It's a lack of belief in Christ's real presence in black and brown bodies. This is not liberal. This is not progressive. This is the first letter of John, where if you do not love the brother or sister whom you see, how can you claim to love the God you cannot see? I just want to make sure people know I'm orthodox here. So then, what are we to do? I think we need to understand that for both black Catholics and white Catholics, our situation is more serious and more complex than we want to realize or face. It's a situation that cannot be resolved simply through better evangelization programs, improved adult catechesis, or the reopening of offices of black Catholics. Not that these things are wrong, but they are inadequate to the magnitude of the challenge that faces us. So what can we do? This would obviously take the work of a lifetime, and I'm committed to doing that work. But I offer these following suggestions. The first, I think, is that we, as Christians, we need to lament the state of our church. We need to grieve over the state of our church. Lament is not passive. It's not a stance of surrender. Lament is a work of personal, communal agency. Laments are expressions of outrage and anger and protest and grief in the cause of justice. Yes, laments can be unruly, and yes, they can be disruptive, but such disruption is the rift or the opening through the possibility of conversion and the possibility of a new beginning. Let me give you an example. In February of 2021, Father Greg Chisholm of the Society of Jesus, who was then pastor of St. Charles Borromeo Catholic Church in Harlem, New York, delivered the homily during the Archdiocese of New York's annual Black History Month celebration at St. Patrick's Cathedral. It's a case study of lament. He began his homily with a loud, piercing, primal scream. It was a wail, a cry from deep within. And then he continued. He said, I am 6'4" tall. I'm almost 70 years old. I have a responsible position in my community in Harlem. 90% of the time, I am the image of the role I hold in the Catholic Church. Most of the time, I would not allow myself to scream. It would be unseemly for me to express the pain, the anger, the disappointment that I felt for most of the past year. But God knows, he says, I felt like screaming. And then riffing off of Marvin Gaye's classic song, Inner City Blues, also known as Makes Me Want to Holler. These are the kind of homilies we need to have in church. You don't forget these. He related how after the traumas of dealing with the COVID pandemic, the hospitalizations and deaths of his black parishioners, the brutal killings and public murders of black people, the deep polarization of our politics, and the vilification and vitriol from Catholic pulpits that have been heaped upon the Black Lives Matter movement, all he could do was holler. And the response from black Catholics in New York And from around the nation was a chorus of amen. Truth to power. It needed to be said. You don't know how much I needed to hear that. To say it was a moment of interruption is an understatement. We need to engage in such lament. We need to mourn the loss of our church. Maybe we need to give up and grieve the lost dream that the church in its present form can never be what we want or need it to be. Now, let me be honest here. I say this because I think many of us hold on to the hope that if only we find the right words said in the right way, that white bishops or white priests or white professors or white seminaries or white religious superiors, that they will see the justice and wisdom of our cause and become born again. But maybe it doesn't always work that way. But I'm not advocating leaving the church, as almost half of my black brothers and sisters have done. I'm not talking about moving out of the church, but into a different way of belonging, where we belong as fully equal people willing to speak uncomfortable truths. And again, I'm not being heretical. This is what the recent document on the Synod and Synodality called for all of us as baptized persons to be willing to accept responsibility for the life of our church and to be willing to speak truth to power and to be willing to move out of codependent relationships of passive obedience and into being active agents who take responsibility for the shape of our church and its future. I'm not advocating moving out of the church, but into a different way of belonging, one that's committed to the church's transformation and renewal. The second thing I think we need to do is that we need to have a more radical understanding of what it means to be Catholic. During the pandemic, I listened to a podcast by two young adult Catholic ministers, one black, one Hispanic. They called their podcast Disinherited, and the first episode was entitled, "What Radicalized You?" As I listened to them tell story after story of being marginalized and trivialized and alienated in overwhelmingly white Catholic spaces, my heart broke. But as I reflected on their all too familiar stories, I realized that they were calling for was a radicalism that was a return to the roots. That Jesus came to be good news for the outcast. Jesus came to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind. And this was the kind of church and faith they were longing for. They wanted a church that affirmed the intelligence and the beauty and the holiness of black lives. They wanted a church that affirmed that black lives are worthy of love and that our lives matter. You see, the genesis of the Black Lives Matter movement came about because 3 black queer women shared love notes to black people saying that we are enough and we are lovable and our lives matter. And one of them took a hashtag and put it in front of it and said, yes, Black Lives Matter. And it's something more than simply about protests or body cameras. it's about affirming the beauty, the intelligence, the holiness of Black lives. That Black lives can mirror the sacred. That God can speak in and through a Black body. That Black bodies mirror the divine and the sacred. That's the kind of church we need to create. And in order to create that church, we need a deep conversion, a metanoia, a return to the gospel of Jesus Christ, a Jesus Christ who reached out to the outcast and the lost and affirmed their dignity, their value, and their worth. That's the kind of radicalism we need in the church. Some might say that's a bridge too far. Some might say that this talk has been terribly divisive. But the alternative is to live in the present and to witness the slow withering of Black Catholicism in the United States, and with it, the gradual extinction of both a Catholic sensibility among Black people and the extinction of authentic Catholic faith in America. And I, for one, am not willing to settle for either alternative. Let me conclude then on an ending that's not an ending, but a summons to a new beginning. It's a note of tense hope, a blues hope, the only kind of hope that's adequate to the situation that we find ourselves in, and the kind of hope that I believe is genuinely reflective of Christian conviction. It comes from that brilliant witness, James Baldwin. James Baldwin. I teach a course at Fordham on Martin Malcolm Baldwin in the church. It's fun. I love it. At the end of his life, Baldwin was asked by a reporter, "Do you have hope?" And he said, "I do believe. I really do believe in the New Jerusalem. I really do believe that we can all be better than we are. I know we can. But the price is enormous. And people are not yet willing to pay it." My hope, my prayer, my vocation is to move the Catholic community to that place where one day we will be willing to pay the price, and so that we can truly be sisters and brothers in the Lord. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Massingale, for that thoughtful and powerful lecture. We do have a few minutes for a couple of questions.
I'm going to stand over here next to this. I mean, it is, it's beautiful. Thank you so much to the artists. Thank you. This is... There's a question over here.
Oh.
Dr. Noelle will be, Dr. Pratt will be handling the.
Yes, I
yeah.
will be.
Okay, so.
So yes, please. Yes.
Thank you.
Just curious, what happens at the local Catholic church when you want to speak to the pastor or speak to someone about racism, and they say, I really can't do that because it's going to make my congregation too uncomfortable? I mean, does the bishop back them up on something like that, or how does the whole structure, work?
You want to repeat the question?
Yes. So
for the benefit of our people at home and by live stream, we'll make sure we repeat the question.
So the question was, how does one respond at the level of the local church when one goes to one's pastor and says, these are the things that we should be addressing, and the pastor's concerned about it being divisive?
Or making people uncomfortable. Okay, then my question is, what people are being made uncomfortable? No, seriously, we need to raise that question. Whose comfort are we talking about here? Because frankly, right now, you can't see it, but right now my deodorant's not working really well. No, seriously, that whenever I give a talk like this, I have to become very vulnerable. And so people expect me to be uncomfortable, and that's okay. But why is it that the only group that's not supposed to feel uncomfortable in talking about race are white people? I just simply have to raise that question. The other thing we need to raise is that it's not that the pastor is not willing to make people uncomfortable, because the Catholic Church makes people uncomfortable about lots of things it says. I'm just putting it out there. I'm just being honest. We're willing to make people uncomfortable when it comes to issues of reproductive morality. We're willing to make people uncomfortable when it comes to issues of sexuality. And we really don't say, we can't talk about LGBTQ issues because some people might be offended. We don't say that. And so what are we willing to make people uncomfortable for? I think we need to raise that question and for that question to be asked. In other words, I admit that there are people who raise the exact question. I've heard that raised myself. And my response is, let's talk about discomfort. Let's talk about why we're willing to make people uncomfortable. Which groups are we willing to make uncomfortable? And then the next thing I would say is that then it comes a point of seizing your own agency and saying, if he won't raise the issue, there's nothing that tells me I can't gather a group of Catholics that are interested in the parish and then begin to talk about, let's start reading. Let's talk about the Black Catholic syllabus that my colleague up here has curated. We don't need everybody to be on board. We need leaven, mustard seeds. And again, to challenge this myth of comfort. Whose comfort is being privileged here? And to say, why are we willing to make people uncomfortable on some issues, but not on other issues? Because frankly, we're willing to say, this is what we have to say because this is what we believe as Catholics. Well, the last I've checked, and here I'm going to again be very orthodox here. I'm quoting Pope Francis, who in the summer of 2020, after George Floyd was murdered, he said that we cannot turn a blind eye to racism or exclusion of any form and claim to be protecting the sanctity of human life. So, what does it mean to be pro-life? And again, the popes, beginning with Pope St. John Paul II, with Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis, have always said that being pro-life is not only about being against abortion. In fact, Pope Francis, again, equally sacred. No, let's not Pope Francis, because Pope Francis is too liberal for some people. So let's talk about Pope John Paul II, who during his last pastoral visit to the United States gave a homily at St. Louis. And he called upon Catholics to be unconditionally pro-life. And he said, as part of being unconditionally pro-life, it means taking a stance against euthanasia, against the death penalty, and opposing racism in every form. That's what it means to be unconditionally pro-life. So if your priest tells you that we can't talk about racism, tell him, let's talk about pro-life then, Father. That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm reading a book which was suggested to me by a Holy Rosary sister who's my neighbor. You are quoted in it frequently, Dr. Pratt, and so are you, Father. It's Untying the Knot, I think. It's by a theologian at the South College in Philadelphia.
LaSalle College in Philadelphia, my friend Dr. Maureen Connell, yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Who is here somewhere, or at least is Maureen here somewhere? Where?
She was here. I can't find her, but she was here. Yes.
Earlier, yeah.
I was shocked at one thing that I learned in the book. Bishop Kendrick of Philadelphia in about 1840 wrote a 3-volume moral theology for all Catholics, and it was a larger diocese then. And he argues very strongly for slavery. He talks about how horrible it would be if the blacks were emancipated, if they were not kept in their place. And I think he even suggests they're subhuman, or at least not as human as Europeans are. My father was a Knight of Columbus. The local chapter here of the Knights of Columbus is the Bishop Kendrick chapter. So I'm shocked. How common was it for bishops or others to write defenses of slavery like that?
You want to repeat the question or summarize it before I answer that one?
So the question started off by talking about writings of Bishop Kendrick, a former bishop of Philadelphia, and his pro-slavery writings. And the question is, how common was it for bishops to write such things?
Unfortunately, very common. That's the sad thing, that Bishop Kendrick was not an outlier. And in fact, the volume that you're referring to was a seminary manual that was used for the training of priests in the United States. Also, we have to remember that at one point in our history, interracial marriages were taught as being sinful by the Catholic Church, and that priests were told not to marry couples who wanted to have an interracial marriage. And then when they were celebrated, and this is in the 1970s, they were often celebrated in a rectory and not in a church, because that would be seen as being offensive. And so I think we need to understand that when I talk about the normative whiteness of the church, this has very deep roots. And so when we're talking about priests not wanting to talk about these issues in the pulpit, this comes from a long history. I would not be terribly shocked if in most seminaries today, seminarians heard nothing about racial justice in their priestly formation. When I was going through the seminary, the first time the seminary ever studied a document on racism was when I did a class project on it. I'm simply saying that I'm glad you brought this up, because oftentimes we look at just our own contemporary experience. We need to understand that we're dealing with issues that have deep, deep roots. And part of what I really appreciate about Maureen's work is that what she does is she draws the connection between what Bishop Kendrick and works like that did, but also how that kind of Catholicism formed her family. In other words, I don't want to come across as blaming white people for saying, why didn't you learn this? Why don't you know this? You don't know it because it wasn't taught to you. And the fact that it wasn't taught to you is not accidental. And so what we need to do is to recover that history so that we can then lament it and grieve it. Because until you face something, you can't be healed of it. And right now, we're all walking around with this weight of centuries, and we don't even know it. To take another example, I had a student, when I took my class on Martin, Malcolm, and Baldwin, I asked him at the end of it, what did you learn that surprised you? And one of them said, I thought that the Black Lives Matter movement started last year. I didn't realize that black people have been protesting against police injustice for decades. And then she said, I'm going to graduate with an honors degree in American history, and I have learned more about the American civil rights movement in a theology class than I did in my history courses. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of ignorance that we're dealing with. So thank you.
So I think we have time for one more. Sister Mary Catherine.
Thank you, Father. I'm a sister servant of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and our foundress was biracial, a woman of color, but she passed as white. The rationale behind this was, as the Oblate sisters would say, is she would be respected, and it was the typical thing that white women would be accepted as religious. She left the Oblate sisters, our cousins, and founded our congregation. In the 50s, or maybe the middle or late 40s, an article was written about her in American Magazine. Cardinal Donohue had that American Magazine taken from all university shelves in this diocese because her
You know, what you just said there, let's take it out of, I thank you for, one, your perseverance, for your tenacity. I know from experience, it ain't easy. There are times I wake up and I look in the mirror and say, what are you doing? Why are you still here? But what you just said, though, is something that's very Catholic. As Catholics, I always say that one of the steps toward reconciliation, we have the sacrament of penance. Well, you see how orthodox I am. So the sacrament of penance. And in the steps of the rite of reconciliation, you begin with an honest acknowledgement of wrong. You don't sugarcoat it. You say, I messed up. I wasn't who I want to be. And this is a universal experience, y'all. I mean, we've all done stuff that, as my daddy would say, what were you thinking? And then he would ask the question for me. You weren't thinking. And I said, well, why ask the question if you already know the answer? Or as we say in the beginning of Mass, we have sinned through what we have done and what we have failed to do. We cannot be reconciled and healed if we don't start with some honest truth-telling. Maybe it's the fact that someone said some stupid stuff or a stupid joke in your presence and you decided, well, you know, he's not really all that bad. That's just the way he was raised. Your grandma likes to say stuff. And then after we admit that we've done wrong, then the next step in the sacrament is you've got to be sorry. You've got to have contrition. And in the rite of penance, it says that's the most important part. Because without genuine sorrow, nothing changes. It'd be like your friend saying, yeah, I acted like an a-hole in front of you, but, you know, I'm not sorry. That's not confession. Contrition. And then we have to acknowledge it. People often say, why do I have to confess to a priest? Because sometimes things get real when you have to speak it out loud. Mm-hmm. And then the next step in the sacrament is that you've got to do some penance. You've got to make right what was wrong. You've got to heal the wound. This is very traditional. Back when I was in second grade going through the sacrament, it's like you're told if you stole something, if you wanted to be forgiven, you had to return it, or you had to put the money in the poor box in church, or something like that. If you harmed somebody with lies, you had to do what you had to do to repair the damage. And so to be healed, we need to engage in acts of reparation. And that's a hard lesson in our country. But again, our sacramental tradition gives us the way. And then after we've confessed and we're sorry and we've admitted what we've done wrong and we've done what we've done to repair the damage, the next step in the sacrament is that you can go in peace. And so this gives me a good place to end on. There is hope. Thank you, sister, for sharing that. There is hope. But that hope ain't cheap. It means that we've got to do the work. And we as Catholics, we have the blueprint for it in our own sacramental tradition. So let's go out, y'all, and let's be good Catholics. And let's do the work.